Okay, so let me go right back into it. I just wanted to clean up some more things before I do the more important thing, which is not prepared yet for me to try to present on, which is that I'm going to sort of use Metatype 13 uh, and do all the clerical work for all the Metagram circuits within Metatype 13, because there are basically three different subtypes of Metagram 13. Although some of those subtypes can also be quite complicated because they're pretty much they all have some kind of split circuit, or they all have some kind of double circuitry potential within them. So it'll be quite a nice variety case to get into because, well, I think my one is the only true double circuit. The other ones are partial double circuits, but anyway, which is why I think I can be bipolar. So why, for example, certain personality styles have the capacity to develop bipolar, and then I'll give sort of my theories around that. But anyway, I'm also at some point I need to talk about metatype in a much more intelligent way, in a much more detailed way, and because I have already done this and I've forgotten more stuff about this than I. But anyway, I'll be able to dig it out because you can come to some very decent constructs that would probably describe narcissism very well. In terms of, I mean, I was saying that, the unconscious side of the mind has a lot of, a lot of pathology essentially centers around the unconscious side of the mind. And anyway, like, narcissists are doing something very special in conjunction with their subconscious. I think they are sort of supplement, they in some sense they never developed a subconscious. In some sense they always developed a kind of that secret devotion that I was just talking about becomes their primary interface with their subconscious, and they kind of have to bolster that with a kind of unconscious apparatus that, so in some sense their substitution for having a subconscious in some sense becomes this is why they're so dependent on creating or instigating provocation in their environment, in their kind of introjective paradigm, because if they don't echolocate reality through the collective intelligence of a kind of introjective paradigm, so they have to be connected with other people that are kind of creating a web, like a spider web, an unconscious web that substitutes for subconscious perspectival framework. So in some sense they have to sort of, they only gain access to a pseudo subconscious through a kind of unconscious signpost, which is essentially another person that is a node in that web. So they're kind of echolocating reality through their unconscious, and they are usually relating to the unconscious through an ego that can only relate to the unconscious as a collective monolith, essentially. And sort of when you conflate reality into not a series of rooms that are connected with one another, but just a kind of homogenized sort of, there's a kind of existential cynicism there, because in some sense they know that the unconscious is just a kind of game that people play. It's just a kind of participatory sort of circus in some sense, and so they are just always setting themselves up as the ringleader of that, and they're not really acting in the participatory realm with any fidelity because they have no anchorage in a subconscious themselves. So they essentially, and borderlines as well, essentially don't have a subconscious, but they can. Borderlines are slightly different because borderlines pretend to have a subconscious. Their chimeric avatar, in some sense they have an introjective puppet that represents themselves within the unconscious, but that is linked to a pretend valence, a pretend subconscious that they, so they have this very strange subconscious framing, which is very brittle. It's as soon as it gets impinged on by somebody else, so like if there's another unconscious identity or introjective object that can actually have a two-way communication with their subconscious framing, then it loses its luster, because then it can't create a one-way flow. So they need to create a kind of sort of booby trap, or essentially their identity is just this kind of Lolita naivety, you know, kind of like this, you know, it's both a woman, a sexual, I mean, I'm just using the stereotype as of a borderline woman, you know, that they both have the sexual prowess of being an adult female with using their sexuality as a kind of, as a tool, as an instrument. But then the next moment they're this naive little innocent girl that essentially has to depend on a kind of paternalism or something like that. So, you know, they sort of they have the adult aspect of being able to express their wants, but they don't have the accountability when essentially when following, you know, their gestures and their suggestions, when that avails to some failure or some lack of, you know, they often play this game where they have so many expectations which they all want fulfilled, even though those expectations are sort of or even contradictory. They cannot occur simultaneously. You know, they are mutually exclusive. So they'll have a whole set of subconscious perspectives which all have a kind of expectation attached to them. They all have a one-way linkage to the unconscious participatory thing as to an expectation as to, you know, what should be done in some sense. But they don't act with responsibility in terms, they don't have any subconscious responsibility for the unconscious realm. That all gets diverted onto somebody else's ego. So they have a kind of codependent ego where they are sharing their ego with somebody else. Whereas narcissists, I think, have a kind of codependent unconsciousness, which is why that they can sort of provoke people into jumping into their five-ring circus, you know. So they're kind of, you know, narcissists are strangely sort of more, they have a more of an internal locus of control around propagating their own psychological pathology in some sense, whereas borderlines, because they actually use this subconscious as a kind of, as a lure, as a kind of, as a baited hook, they have to pretend to be this naive and innocent subconscious, and then they have to kind of rope someone into having a kind of shared ego with them, a kind of and in some sense they just want to have a one-way input. They want to have their subconscious priming the unconscious with expectations, but somebody else's ego must sort of must take the blame for any failure of, you know, sort of the lack of an outcome. And so it is a very sort of strange kind of strategy, and I consider the borderline strategy to actually be very capable of being cured, because if people are aware of this and they don't tolerate it, they grow out of it. Like, this is a kind of thing which a 4-year-old can develop this tactic or this strategy, and it can be disciplined out of them essentially. If they have the right kind of parenting, or the right kind of let's say, if they have the right kind of peers that hold them accountable, and they don't let them play this kind of identitarian game of just saying, you know, oh, well, I didn't know, so, you know, like, I'm an innocent little girl or something like that. Like, you know, don't hold me accountable for the complications of things, like my intentions were pure. Like, that becomes essentially the seed of this sort of this quite toxic game of externalization of blame and a kind of one-way codependency of the ego, because in some sense they never have to establish an ego that has a kind of natural feedback with the subconscious. But anyway, oh, sorry, I mean, there's also, in both the narcissist and the borderline, there are special things also happening in conjunction with the superego. And in some sense, I think that they could both be described as being somewhat superego focused. But the borderline actually I think their seat of consciousness is a phrase that I've used a lot before in older recordings. The borderline seat of consciousness, I think, is actually in the superego, whereas the narcissist is more in the ego. And so the narcissist has a broken false ego complex, whereas it's arguable that the borderline, in some sense, knows that the whole false ego complex, or at least even the metagram translation of the false ego complex, is just a game that people play. And so they are using it quite cynically. They've found a way to game the system. And yeah, so I mean, like, there is a lot of intuitive insight behind the borderline, but you never really see it because it's sort of, it's the demon, chess playing demon in the background, and you only see the baited hook on the chessboard, but they are playing it. And I know that some people will think, oh, you know, you are ascribing way too much agency to these people, but and it is true that the borderline has a malleable subconscious, and in some sense that, you know, you could say, well, how do they ever migrate from having this setup into a stable subconscious, because that is really their symptom. But it's really the ego that, you know, it does pose some challenges if a clinician is going to kind of walk someone through this. Because it's, you know, you kind of have to, people don't realize that when they started to develop the false ego complex at a very young children are in like a dreamlike state. You can't really measure the IQ of someone who is 1 year old, but their IQ is phenomenal. I mean, they're learning a first language, you know, their brain is making connections like you cannot believe. Very, very young children are incredibly intelligent, essentially. And you have to be, in order to start developing the false ego complex. And as I was trying to say, that, you know, there's a secret devotion around the inferior function that is setting up a kind of a virtual or a pseudo worship just to get this thing up and running. And the borderline never graduated that hump, as it were. I mean, like, they never did that properly, or they did, but then when they started developing their subconscious, they worked out, well, why have a stable subconscious when I can just have an unstable subconscious, and somebody else has to pick up the pieces. Somebody else's ego will have to come in and supplement for my lack of having a supported ego from a subconscious. So they kind of, they leaned into a kind of brittle vulnerability because somebody else, essentially because they worked out that they could, through some kind of unconscious glue, they could just kind of project it onto somebody else. They could get somebody else to sort of play the butler and clean up after them. Now, you know, and that usually involves, in terms of the unconscious, that there's a lot of objective bullshit in the unconscious, which is very much a carbon copy of the superego chess-playing demon. So basically, to support what the borderline is doing, you have to believe that there are objective identity categories, that you have a kind of, you have a kind of equivalency between the doing and what is and what you are and what you do then. So, like, see, I know that this is confusing. To call the superego what is doing, and the unconscious is what you do. The difference is that what you do is subjective, and what you are doing in some sense is kind of, is much more visceral and much more real and much more sort of right. You know, I mean, obviously what we are doing gets obscured by the false ego complex. So, you know, this gets buried in a kind of shadow. Let me not get confused and use double language here. So you could call this the environmental unconscious. The superego is the environmental unconscious, but let me just call it the shadow, as distinguished from the unconscious. So the reason why the unconscious itself is, I call it the unconscious, is because what you do, in some sense, is very complicated. it's so complicated. It has so many implications. It has so many correlates and parallel and tandem, you know, kind of inculcated significances, which you are semi-aware of, but you're mostly unconscious of them because they're unconscious in relation to your subjective sense of what it is that you do. So when you do, when you do something, you have a definition of what it is that you're doing, but that definition has a kind of infinite exponential implication that you don't know what the future of it is going to be. So you can do something, but you don't know the consequence, you know. So in some sense, it's unconscious because karma, you cannot take hold of karma. You can be responsible in some kind of internal locus of control, but in an internal locus of control, at some point, can't abrogate everybody else's responsibility. I mean, this is a metaphysical kind of spiritual sort of thing. Like, you know, I believe that this is part of the teaching of Christ. Essentially, is that you have to understand that your mind needs to be regarded as the only begotten Son. The condition of your mind is the only begotten Son of God that takes on the sin of the world. When you are saving the world, therefore, you're not redeeming the world, because the world cannot be redeemed. But you are offering redemption to the world on your shoulders, through your mind. And that is why you get crucified by the world. Because when you do that, it doesn't stop the world from crucifying you. Because you still don't know what the future is. Because no one knows what the future will bring. That is held by the Holy Ghost, which is forbidden knowledge. You'll never know what the Holy Ghost knows, because if you did, then you would know the knowledge of good and evil, and you would be dead in that day. You will die in that day that you know your future self. Because if you know your future self, then there is no more life. Because then life is translated into a binary of good and evil, or something like that. And so you can't do the knowledge of good and evil. You can do life or something like that. But it's a very complicated understanding in terms of forming. Okay, anyway. So the point is that you can do the present, but you can't do the future. Okay? But that's why it's unconscious, is because that mystery of the Holy Ghost and forbidden knowledge can only be extricated from the unconscious, from the participatory field, with a proper doctrinal understanding. So in some sense, the unconscious side of the mind is the most fundamentally complex. And in some sense, you could even say that all the beasts of karma that I've described, the four beasts and the wheels within wheels and the emotional tones that have their mechanical impingement on one another, and they all have their field circuits, and the field circuits interrelate to one another. It's very, very complicated. In some sense, that's all happening within the unconscious. That's an intrinsic thing that the unconscious can't run away from. And in some sense, you can overcome that by being quicker than it, but you can't dissolve it you can't wish it away. You can't turn it off. So you have to be quicker than it, and that's how you transcend it, as it were. But that is a gauntlet that has to be run. You have to go through that. You have to go through that fire. You can't just kind of try to forget about it. So anyway, why was I getting into this? Because I was talking about borderlines using their unconscious side of the mind. That in some sense what borderlines will have done is that instead of actually dealing with life as a subjective individual from the perspective of the subconscious and the ego in some sense, they are only dealing with it from the perspective of the subconscious, not the ego. They are compartmentalizing responsibility. The egoic propositional, somebody else has to make the propositional grammar correct. Somebody else can burden that, and they will just subconsciously impose their motivational, sort of, so this is how they protect their child function in their subconscious. You could also put it like that. But also the dominant function in their subconscious is also potentially toxic to their child function. So their dominant function in their subconscious can never grow up, because if it does, then they would realize that there are basic costs that will always, that this always results in sin. So they need to find a way to scapegoat this child function or the sin of their subconscious. They need to find a way to blame somebody else for that. But anyway, essentially how they do this as a chess player, what I've just said is in the valence of explaining it as if they had a serious subconscious, but they don't have a serious subconscious. This is just a puppet. This is just a ploy. This is just a baited hook. It's a lure. Like the lamp fish that has a little light in front of them to lure the other fish, and then they eat them. That's what a borderline is. But essentially, the dominant function in their unconscious is essentially getting its marching orders from their superego, and there's almost a direct communication between these things. And you can tell this because sometimes the borderline's manipulation is just far too Machiavellian. You know that there's a deeper intelligence behind the social manipulation. Yes, they can seemingly torture themselves because they're breaking their own frame. They're breaking their own subconscious constantly. They're dying and being reborn in terms of their subconscious because it's a useless chimera, so that they destroy it and they want to begin again, so that they can try a new angle of subversion, a new angle of incepting somebody else to adopt their unconscious side of the mind. So they just want to have the right drama populated in this. And it's coming from this. This is where it's coming from. And so you can see that there's a very... Thematically, if Metatype was more understood, I think that people would know... they could see that this dominant function is colluding with this dominant function, essentially. And so that you actually know that there is a very deep intelligence happening within the borderline, and it's essentially operating from this, and it's making the subconscious fall on its own sword constantly. Anyway, so that's basically what's happening in borderline. Narcissism, I will have to kind of think about it on some more, because I kind of have to tune into it. Maybe I have to listen to Sam Vaknin, and then I get a nice picture of it, and then I kind of I'd lose these things very quickly, because I'm dealing with a lot of things. I'm working on Metagram at the moment, but I've also explained before a lot how narcissism is all about, because in some sense the introjective paradigm is related to the unconscious, but it's also very much related to the subconscious. But the borderline is playing games with this on purpose. The narcissist needs this. So the narcissist is like a drug addict. They need this. This is their fix. The borderline already has their fix in some sense. This is what they want. And in some sense, it's about gaming this to play the game over here. And in some sense, as long as they know that somebody else is tending to this, it doesn't even matter. As long as they can kind of crucify somebody else's subconscious. So their subconscious ends up gobbling up other people's subconscious in a very kind of toxic way, but which the narcissist can actually enjoy, because the narcissist, in some sense, doesn't have any stability here, and they kind of want some kind of structure here. So anyway, there's lots of famous talking about how the narcissist and the borderline gets into this dysfunctional kind of relationship with one another, and in some sense borderlines do breed narcissists. Borderlines can actually cultivate narcissism in people. They can literally break them down by decompartmentalizing their ego. That's also a good way of I think working out what's going on in narcissism. Although you kind of have to slightly reverse engineer what the borderline is doing, because obviously how the borderline is inflicting the trauma is not the same thing as the compensatory psychological damage that is being inflicted. Because in some sense, although they might be aiming to do certain structural damage in order to create a narcissist, the tension might be orchestrated by some other thing. You know, the tension might be held in some other particular body here. But anyway, so I mean, I've gone deep into that in other recordings, but it's not at the top of my mind right now. What did I want to talk about? Oh, I wanted to talk about these things. So this I mentioned right at the beginning, and I never explained properly, but it's going to just illustrate my point here. So the important. So I was going to make a general claim about that. This is why spiritual life is complicated. This is why false religion always propagates itself, I think, within the realm of belief, essentially, is because of what I'm about to show you, is the difference between this. So just to remind everyone that this comes from this. This is what it actually looks like. And these diagrams that I've made here are just to emphasize the difference between mechanical gunas, the alchemical gunas, and the final five perspective. So relative to the subjective thinker, relative to the final five, karmic energy looks like this. Mental objects look like this according to the final five. This all gets conflated because this is all of these three triangles, lion, eagle, and calf, fall between the father and the third dimension, between these two elements of the final five. But relative to the alchemical objects themselves, relevant to the actual beasts themselves, they follow a mechanical internal structure. You know, the wheels within wheels are not the same wheels. And so there's a slight distinction here. There's a slight difference. And because the final five is conflating these things, and because the actual objects themselves are further differentiating themselves, there is some people are going to conflate and some people are going to separate. And the difference between that creates a kind of fundamental mismatch and potential for disagreement and schism, but also a potential of conflation. And in some sense, I think that, you know, this is easy for me to say because I always say this all the time, but I think that this also is why law is important. Because otherwise this will never be uncovered. But I do actually think that this is where evil gets disguised. And because some people are seeing it one way and some people are seeing it a different way. And the difference between that, because some people are insensitive to the more nuanced kind of distinction to be made here, and other people are blind and deaf to that distinction. You kind of get a nexus of dishonesty, or a kind of implicit dishonesty in which anyway, so it's okay, so I can go into this in particular. So these are the field circuits, and you see that all of these things go at a so I think let me see where it's relevant. (17.6) lazy to calm is the same as 2 to 5, or actually it goes 5 to 2 in terms of the arrow. So there's an inverse mechanical symmetry there. Between 17 and 6 is going from 17 to 6, and 5 to 2 is going from 5 to 2. So lazy and calm is inversely symmetrical to relieved and eager. clerical error somewhere. That's annoying. Oh, it's rushed. It's rushed and eager. Excuse me, I read it on this side. I should have read it on this side. It goes from 5 to 2. Rushed and eager. Okay, so it is rushed and eager. Sorry, I just read it wrong. So it's rushed and eager is inversely symmetrical to lazy and calm via the final 5. So it doesn't seem that profound. Let's see if there's anything else here. I guess there might be also something to this as well between lion and calf. But those both relate to 1 and 2 only, which are at least are on the same side of this side. Anyway, I do think I could dig into that and turn that into something, but it's probably going to take me too long and it's going to sound very strained. But I do actually think that there is something to that. In some sense, it's more easy to see if you just kind of relate it to the dimensions themselves, because dimension 17 is tranquility, or the gift of the prophet, and dimension 2 is the spirit, and dimension 5 is prudence, and dimension 13 is faith. Oh, sorry, I shouldn't have said 13, because we're just dealing with this correspondence. So it's 7 and 6. So and 6 is eminence. So that's eminence, or the salt, and tranquility, and the gift of the prophet, and prudence, and spirit, or placidity is what I call dimension 2. Yeah, rushed and eager, lazy and calm. Anyway, I mean, maybe I should think about this more before I try to present about it. But I have often thought that this worried and annoyed part of the field circuit, which comes just before this, I've always thought that when Paul was calling, this isn't what is used in the King James translation, but in other translations, when Paul is calling about is talking about the restrainer. Where in the King James it talks about, he that let, worried and annoyed. I think that this is somewhat the restrainer to this, because I do think that sort of Nazism in some sense is actually, or fascism or totalitarianism in general, is actually trying to turn this into a lazy and calm, a kind of confidence about the gift of prophecy, kind of turning it into an automatic kind of lazy sort of thing, which ends up being quite rushed, because when you're being lazy, inversely you're being rushed. In the sense of these two things, and when you're being calm, virtually you're being eager. And it's interesting because I do think that sort of totalitarianism and fascism has this kind of that's what it's trying to perform this part of the eagle field circuit. It's trying to take any laziness, and it's trying to sort of make it calm while at the same time is creating a kind of virtual eagerness around the spirit, from sort of prudence into this. So you're actually trying to build up both the eagle and the calf. And in some sense, I think that what stops this fundamental driver of a kind of totalitarian sort of conflation, which in some sense I think, because this inverse symmetry comes from conflating this, which is conflating heaven and the flesh, or at least the beginning of anyway. Because that's the in between, is the gift of the prophets, or tranquility, and then the flesh, and then the spirit here. And sort of, if you're just kind of jumping from one between that and that, you're going through this, but you're just kind of, anyway, that's kind of hidden in the sandwich of this inverse symmetry. But that at least coming around the corner of the eagle field circuit is that at some point someone is going to perhaps be worried or annoyed, and that the injection of that insight into this field circuit is going to, at least if you're worried about the right things, it's going to inhibit being annoyed enough, because annoyed is the potential of being lazy, and lazy sort of when you get to the left side of the corner, like if you're calm, you're about to be condescending. If you're bored, you're about to be worried. If you're annoyed, you're about to be lazy. Like that. That's kind of how this works in terms of the arrow of the flow of the field circuit. That at least if you're worried about certain things, you're going to inhibit too much circular flow within this field circuit. But yeah, and I've tried to make the claim that because of this basic conflation, people can believe that something is just one thing, and then you can really inhibit. Essentially, you have dampened the correct inhibition, because then you're not worried about the right things, as it were. And so I think that this is the restrainer that some translations of the Bible Paul is talking about. Except when the restrainer falls away. And I think that when the restrainer falls away is when essentially the people who are worried are actually become more worried about not letting the problem happen, because actually the problem should happen. Maybe society should suffer because they should have to develop their own independent cultural investment into being worried about the right things. They shouldn't be herded like cattle. If they should be willing, I mean, this is I think what it means when it says that Elijah will make the way straight, is that you can't actually see the path to the kingdom of God. You can't see any of these things within yourself if you don't have to be wise, if you don't have to develop experiential wisdom, because things are just traditionally kept in abeyance, because there's a kind of implicit worriedness within the system, within the structure. It's better to remove it and say, no, well, if you want to be worried about something, and if you want to live a high standard of life, you have to be worried about the right things. We're not going to be good for you. We're not going to provide tradition for you. If you don't respect tradition, or you don't understand it, and so you throw it away without wanting to break the bread and consume it and digest it and then digest it again, so that you can actually be careful and serious enough about these things. If you just want to be drunk on this conflation over here and try to be calm about things and just be kind of virtually eager about something, and just have this kind of wonderful affirmation and a kind of affirmative anyway. So I do think that this is a great engine of narrative grifting and false religion, essentially. And in some sense, it is because of the structural abnormality of this that between two final five members there is actually a division here. And in some sense, this makes the father, or the 16th dimension, quite a kind of unique you know, it's interesting that the father is not, you know, sort of right at the pinnacle of the pyramid, but is the second last step of the pyramid, as it were. If you look at this as as a pyramid. And I used to have a little lecture about that, but now I can't remember it. This is a bit annoying, but anyway. I think if there's anything else intelligent I can say about this. So lazy, calm, rushed, eager. Rushed, calm. So it's this thing over here. And I'm saying that the restrainer is over here, just being worried. So if you want to be calm, it's going to create a virtual of being rushed. So what you end up doing is if you succeed at being a totalitarian fascist, you've got a lot of energy in being calm, which is going to translate into a lot of energy of being bored and a lot of energy into being annoyed. And that is going to be kind of the three characteristics, is that you're going to be calm, bored, and annoyed if you want to stabilize that. But because calmness is inversely related to the calf is going to be the opposite. The calf is going to be gummed up by inhibitory things. Is you see the one at the head of the arrow is the one that is the positive emotional tone. This is the negatory. So if you're rushed, it's probably going. If you're rushed enough, it's going to lead into you also being scared and being sad. Rushed, scared, and sad, and this is the calf is going to sort of scream to a halt. So, you know, sort of the more hyper realism that you pump into the ego, the more inhibition you relate into the calf. Not only because of this inverse relationship, but also because of this mechanical inversion as well. So that will also lead to the fact that if you are bored here, then it's also going to lead into being scared in calf, because that is an asymmetry based on alchemical elements. And what's the other thing here to say? Oh, and eagle is also inverse to lion. So, you know, if you just kind of privilege the eagle, then the lion is also going to actually mess up. So in the same way that calf is going to grind to a halt, the lion is going to grind to a halt. But I was just basically trying to say that it's this dimension, I think, of this, that if you try to sort of match being calm with being rushed, and this is I think the mechanic that a lot of delusion, a lot of collective, you know, what do they call it? Group psychosis, you know, or collective psychosis, I think is basically eagle calf. Okay, so I've basically said it. Is between these two things, but because in some sense, so it's this blue star that is particularly potentially toxic, as it were. Now, none of these toxic things are necessarily in themselves bad. If you just know what you're dealing with, you can, it's fine, it doesn't matter, right? It's, you know, like, it just, because then you can be, your eyes can be open to it. It's not a problem then. But, you know, if some people have a personality style that has an emotional tone here and an inverse emotional tone here, then they are going to almost be exemplifications of this conflation, of this inverse symmetry. And so you're going to get what I would call natural fascists. And, you know, how many connections are there? I think, oh my word, I can't actually remember the maths that I did on this. I did actually count these up. It's not in these diagrams. It's in this diagram. So there is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. There are 6 mechanical symmetries and inverse symmetries combined. And then how many stars are there? You have to divide by 2 because I'm linking them. So there's 1, 2, there are 4. So there are only 10. So there's 4 5-star symmetries, and which includes also 1 inverse 5-star symmetry, and there are 6 mechanical alchemical symmetries and inverse symmetries combined. So that makes 10, and then there are also the field circuits themselves, which I guess you could also kind of count. So there are only 10 of these things here. 10 of these special links between the field circuits. Sorry, why did I want to count that up? I wanted to count that up because so anyway, I mean, you know, this is why sort of cognitive axis theory within MBTI is so sort of fraught with problems, because in some sense the whole system is just way too approximate. But it's interesting because it has all the basic kind of right concepts, but a lot of those concepts were imported from my work actually. But anyway, oh, that's probably a huge claim to make, but I'd be very interested to hear any of the major authors contradict me. I should perhaps, should I really put them in that position by stating, I mean, obviously not any of the authors, but the main authors that I dealt with. John Beebe was one of them, and then there were 2 women that were in my living room. But I mean, I've known so many people in the psychology realm. I mean, man, this is so embarrassing. I always forget their names. Oh my word. Let me see. What's her name? Famous expert on borderline. Actually, I helped. I shouldn't say things like this. I shouldn't try to name drop. It's unseemly as well. But I mean, she's one of those, essentially. I mean, I helped her develop a dialectical behavior therapy. It's so embarrassing. I apologize that I can't remember people's names. It's well, you know, this is the cost of leading a double life and having messed up memories, or I'm just a crazy sort of crackpot. But anyway. I shouldn't go into these details, it's not really relevant. should I talk about now? Sorry, I was talking about how that there would be natural fascists because some people's metagram circuitry will have this inverse symmetry somewhat represented in between their primary counteroffer and their emergent response. Essentially, the foundation of their unconscious and the foundation of their ego will essentially include one of each of these, but that will be opposite. And what see, like the metagram circuitry is an important way to create a kind of polarity within the metatype. These are old diagrams. Is that you don't want the unconscious mixing with the ego too much, because then the superego is going to sort of lose control. So I think that there is a natural propensity for this emotional tone that is in the foundation of the unconscious to have a kind of opposite polarity to the foundation of the ego, so that there's a kind of, I mean, in some sense there already is a kind of sort of wall here, because when this sends something to the inferior function here, it doesn't go anywhere else. It doesn't loop back around. And this creates an asymmetry for the superego to essentially remain in control. As you can see, it's kind of, it's in a, can't think of the word, but it's by itself. It's just by itself, and it gets to kind of start the ball rolling. So it can kind of stay in this preeminent position where it doesn't get any feedback from the system. It just gets to send things. So this is sort of the most kind of independent power of the entire structure. Problem is that you can't even get into this end game until you do the requisite work with these, with the subconscious, unconscious, and the ego. And I'm just basically saying that there is a kind of structural impediment here that has to do with metagram, and that in that way metagram will offer a lot of complications to metatype. It will also create an interesting kind of variety, because essentially because metagram is going to represent dimensions of psychological reality that are inflected, that are impinging each other, or either, you know, kind of creating a natural energy flow within karmic energy, within, in some sense, within tracking what it is that you do, because it's going to be part of the terrain of in which you have to, the medium in which that you have to live is going to be populated by these metaphysical beastly entities, as it were, these karmic constructions. And you're not going to be able to dissolve them. In fact, they can't be dissolved. You have to actually familiarize with yourself to them, and you have to be quicker than them. You have to learn to master them in some sense. And so I do think that there's a huge amount of something like dialectical behavior therapy, that this can be taught. And in some sense, this is what is being somewhat objectified, or at least in dialectical behavior therapy. Am I saying it the right way? Yeah. Just dialectal behavior, dialectal. Is that you're breaking down things on such an elementary level, so that you can keep your internal locus of control, you can monitor your internal locus of control, and you can create, in some sense, I think that what is happening when you are providing dialectical behavior therapy to a borderline is you are forcing them to cast a spell, a narrative spell on themselves, that will hopefully eventuate in giving them the social, you could call it social support, but also social pressure into not being able to break that spell of a coherent and self-consistent subconscious. So you are talking them into, making them talk themselves into having a persistent subconscious that they can't just undress from and recapitulate, or just dissolve and chimerically recompose from, you know, take, you know, it's they're kind of like Dr. Monroe, what's his name, you know, and what was that, the island of Dr. Monroe, you know, that you just kind of, you know, you just sew things, you know, it's like Frankenstein's monster, you just sew things together and you create a new concoction. You know, the old me didn't work, so I'll just wish it away and then recompose it and push the restart button. And in some sense, you are trying to get them to talk themselves into banishing the reset button, that they no longer have that power to just sort of, at their unilateral wish, reset their own identity. And you can really see how identity politics is trying to hand people that capacity. It's like, no, no, you have the right to relativistically, unilaterally define the game that everybody else has to play along with. You know, it's literally saying, be a borderline personality disordered person. It's literally saying, this is how, this is the basic game that borderlines are playing. Here, you play along. You know, you go and disrupt and sort of discombobulate and decompartmentalize other people's egos, because the ego is a representation of white supremacy or the patriarchy or some other sort of conflated narrative bullshit. Anyway, this is also interesting to talk about, because this is also going to sort of cause schism with people, but for the opposite reason. Because to some people, this is symmetrical relative to their final five perspective, or relative to anyone's final five perspective, but other people are going to relate to this inversely on a mechanical level. Anyway, yeah, I'll have to start talking about actual metagram circuits individually to sort of get into more useful sort of details. Also, I mean, it would be interesting if probably if I overlaid dimensions, particular dimensions onto this, just so that you could get a feeling of what someone looks like, or use an actual example. Although I don't have that many examples of people that have typed. I haven't typed people in a very, very, very long time, pretty much. Anyway, let me think about the next thing that I could make a video about.